Hi, in this video we're going to look at how demand and supply interact with each other and determines a market equilibrium. In the next section we're going to then introduce a tool that allows us to look at specifically how changes in various factors shift the market equilibrium. That will be a tool that gives a very rich interpretations of what happens in the market. So first of all, let's think about the definition of a market equilibrium. Anyone who has taken any sort of economics class understands that, well, if you have a demand curve, a supply curve, you put them together and there's one place they cross and that's our equilibrium and that's it. So everyone sort of gets that. But equilibrium, in fact, is a much more general and powerful concept beside the crossing of two lines. And it is, in general, a notion of stability. What it really means is that once we're in this particular type of situation, it's very difficult for any one party to move away from it individually. In addition to market equilibrium, later on in the course, we're going to look at a notion in game theory such as Nash equilibrium, and all of these equilibrium concepts share a notion of stability. In the context of market equilibrium, we have a quantity demanded, a quantity supplied. Both are functions of price. And if we plot both the supply and demand curves on the same axis, we can see that they don't generally coincide with each other. For instance, on this graph on the right-hand side, when the price is at $3.95, the quantity supplied is a lot higher than the quantity demanded. And in particular, we have a 39 units of excess supply here. Whereas when the price is a lot lower at $2.65, the quantity demanded is going to be higher than quantity supplied. So at this price, consumers are willing to buy a lot more than the firms are willing to sell. So in these scenarios, we imagine that the market will not stay where they are at these price levels. And the intuition is that when the price is high, such that the suppliers are willing to sell a lot more than consumers are willing to buy, what happens is producers are going to end up with excess inventory they want to get rid of. So what do is they can lower prices by offering discounts, and that will attract more consumers into buying this product, and the price is going to descend. Whereas in the opposite scenario where the price is very low, such that the consumers are dying to buy a lot more than what the firms are willing to sell, then the consumers will actually bid up prices in different markets. If you think about examples of very popular shows, sports events, or think about very popular products that run out on the official website, prices tend to be a lot higher on the black markets or secondhand markets. In between of these two scenarios, we believe there is a particular outcome where consumers and suppliers are both reasonably happy with the outcome. In terms of this graph, when the price is at $3.30, the consumers are willing to buy exactly the same amount that the suppliers are willing to sell, and this is giving us the market equilibrium in this market, because we believe, again, is a stable environment where consumers doesn't have any incentive to raise prices to bid the price any higher, and suppliers don't have any incentive to offer extra discounts to get rid of inventory. So in a graph like this, it's really straightforward for us to point our fingers and say that's the equilibrium. But how do we identify the equilibrium in a way that does not involve pointing? It turns out the general definition of market equilibrium is the following. And bear with me as I unpack this package of notations. So first of all, what we want to recognize is that any market equilibrium is simply a point on the price quantity axis. And in particular, it is just a coordinate. Out of all the possible points in this two-dimensional space, there is only one point that is an equilibrium. That's where we're pointing at. So in our definition, what we're saying is a market equilibrium is a pair of price and quantity. And it's not just any price and quantity. They're somewhat special. So in order to distinguish them from all these other prices and quantities, we're going to put stars around them. So then which particular point are we going to put stars on them? Well, they have to satisfy a particular condition, and that is the demand and supply curves have to cross at this particular point. So when would this pair of price and quantity be special such that demand and supply curves would cross? Or the buyers and sellers would agree on how much they are willing to buy and sell? Well, we can post the same price to the sellers and the consumers. And we ask them, at this particular price, how much are you willing to sell, and how much are you willing to buy. If the quantity supplied at this particular price is exactly the same as the quantity demanded from the consumers at this particular price, then we have an equilibrium. In other words, if we can find a very particular price level such that the demand curve and the supply curve pop out exactly the same quantity value, then this price is special. And that quantity value is also special. And that is our market equilibrium. If you look back to the graph, that's exactly what we're trying to describe when we think through it. At the same price level of 330, quantity demanded and quantity supplied are both 220 on this graph, and they agree. Once you move away from this particular P star level of 330, quantity demanded is no longer in agreement with quantity supplied. We have been discussing the benefits of using demand and supply functions and how much convenience we would have gotten from these tools, in addition to just looking at the graphical representations of demand and supply curves. So now, with the definition of market equilibrium in mind, we're going to look at a particular example where we use demand and supply functions to identify the market equilibrium in this particular scenario. So now let's think back to our processed pork example. After plugging in the particular values for other factors besides price, we end up with these two simple expressions of demand curve and supply curve. Now, to identify the market equilibrium with these very simple demand and supply functions, all we are going to do is just the following. So our first step is to make use of market equilibrium definition that we just learned on the previous slide. Specifically, we're just going to write down exactly what they are. So the definition says, well, what is a market equilibrium? Well, it is when at the same price level of P star, quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. That's exactly copy and pasted from the previous slide. So now, coming to this particular example, we actually have a very particular expression for QD and a very particular expression for QS. And both of them are functions of P. So in this particular example, we're just going to plug in the definition of QD here and QS here. And that's what happens. If we plug in these particular expressions, now we end up with a particular function with only one variable, which is P star. And we can solve this linear equation by collecting terms on both sides. That gives us 60 P star, and collecting the constants on the other side of the equality. And then we can find P star is equal to 330. And that's exactly the price level that equilibrates the market on the previous slide in our graph. So now we have identified the magical price or the equilibrium price in the market that sets the quantity supplied to be equal to quantity demanded. But what is the equilibrium quantity? If I ask that question without showing you the graph, can you find it? Well, the next step is actually really straightforward. We just need to plug in this particular price level to either the demand function or the supply function. In other words, we just need to associate the same price level 330 to either the demand curve or the supply curve, and the corresponding quantity hopefully will be the same, and that will be our equilibrium quantity level. If you try this, you'll realize that we would end up with a quantity of 220 from both functions. So now we have calculated our market equilibrium, which is a price of 330 and quantity of 220. And that's exactly what we have seen in the previous graph. Of course, this is a very, very particular example with lots and lots of assumptions in it about all these other factors that shifts demand and supply. In the next video, we're going to look at a particular tool called comparative statics that will give us a way to analyze the equilibrium